Morning all. Let's continue our look at that amazing match earlier this year between Stockfish and Komodo. So this is round 9, and actually we get a very interesting opening. They've been set these book positions, book starts. So this is from their book. We get actually a Benoni, a modern Benoni. This used to be a favourite of Mikhail Tal. For many years, Mikhail Tal was winning several games with this system. It's compromising a bit in theory the pawn structure. In particular, the Son of Sorrow pawn, this d6 pawn, is often subject to torture. Often White's getting this kind of thing in to torture that d6 pawn. So it's interesting to see high-level computer Komodo playing this position, or forced to play this position. So knight f3, g6, bishop g5, bishop g7. Of course, in compensation for this structure, Black enjoys a pawn majority on the queen side, pressure on the e-file, good dark square grip generally on e5 and d4. So there's compensating dynamic factors to bear in mind. Knight d2, h6, bishop retreats. And now here I think they're out of book. Knight bd7 was the first move thought of actually by Komodo. So here we are. White, according to my Stockfish at low depths, is standing slightly better at the moment. e4, Black castled, bishop e2, and we see this move g5, which is not only a tempo gainer but actually reinforces Black's grip, it seems, at some level on the dark squares here after bishop g3. This seems to be useful, this f4 and e5. Queen e7, protecting d6, so reinforcing that e5. And you can see with this structure here for White, this bishop actually doesn't have too much scope. This diagonal is closed off at the moment because of that pawn, and that's an important strategic consideration. Also, these knights sometimes would like to use that e4 square, so it's not just the e4 square on the light square, it's the other squares here. Imagine if these were all opened up. That's an interesting question when we look at the rest of this game. White castles here. Now Black plays knight e5, which is seemingly tempting f4, but the knight can potentially go to g6 after, and wouldn't White basically have isolated that e pawn? But here, that question is posed: what else does White want to do in this position with the knight sitting on e5? Knight c4, for instance. Maybe Black just takes, and actually can just take this without too much punishment here. So basically f4 is actually played, and in a way now it's White that's accepting some structural issues here, the isolated e pawn, but getting some compensating dynamic factors in this position after g takes, bishop takes. Of course, a compensating dynamic factor is this f-file. But is this really significant, this f-file? Well, f7 is the point closest to Black's king, so watch out for that later. Bishop d7, king h1. The knight does go to g6, and it looks at this point, after bishop g3, that Black has an interesting dark square grip on the position. These squares, pressure on e4. And if given time, might actually even use the queenside pawn majority here. The 3-2 here to White's 2 pawns. Okay, so knight e5 is played here. h3, denying Black the g4 square, slightly weakening the king side in the process. Knight h7, and the knight can actually now head to g5, which would seem impressive to have both knights like that. Queen c2, rook fe8, and now we see White playing rook f2. So the queen getting out of the way there, supporting this idea of doubling the rooks. And you might think, well, is this really an exploitable target, f7? It's secure with this knight at the moment, and it's going to be even more secure now after this next move for a moment. Knight g5 protecting f7. You might think, well, is h4 possible? Let's just check this out in this position. If h4, the knight can actually go back and damage done. Say we attack like this. Potentially, I mean, I don't think we're actually threatening to take here because there's now this liability. So that knight is enough defense here, it seems, for f7 basically. So is that really an exploitable target? Nevertheless, let's see. So rook a f1, a6, showing the idea that maybe, you know, there's some queenside expansion on the cards. a4, trying to prevent any expansion. Rook a b8, b5 on the cards. And now we have an interesting continuation that the knight is actually kicked. Knight h7, so the queen's glaring at h4, so it makes this knight potentially stronger, but here the knight is hit with knight c4. And a very interesting, fascinating continuation we're about to witness here. Well, first of all, what if black leaves this situation here with the tension and let's just say plays rook f8 to defend f7? Well, knight takes, bishop takes, we can take here, and I think this is unpleasant now for black after queen d2 looking at h6. I think black's worse for wear here. Potentially bishop d3 with rook f4 coming, so say like this, rook f3, and it looks as though, or rook f4, and it looks as though black is suffering here a little bit. The blockader on e5 is not as ideal as a knight. White's f-file pressure does seem a little bit more significant. Okay, so let's go back to the game continuation. In fact, black committed now to take here. And here, usually giving up two rooks for a queen isn't such a good deal, but it is actually played in this position. Rook takes f7. So black took, rook takes f7, king takes. So two rooks for the queen. So is white going to recapture his knight, its knight, with bishop takes? Well, no, actually another interesting possibility is chosen instead, leaving this knight attacked but attacking another knight, and quite impressive positional consideration, really. Well, in effect, from the brute force calculations, because the thing is, if we routinely capture this knight here, I think black can set up quite a good dark square blockade with bishop e5, and this diagonal will remain kind of closed because of this pawn. White will never be able to use that e4 as easily in this position. So say this position, it looks as though there's a good blockade opportunity here for black in this sort of position. Say a check, knight f6, you just see that black's going to be a hard nut to crack here. So an interesting decision at this moment, instead of taking that knight routinely, to play instead, well, I wonder if you can guess it, if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video starting from now. Okay, e5, attacking this knight, opening up that diagonal, of course a pawn sack instead of recapturing the knight. So that pawn is actually taken, so a pawn invested there, just to literally just open up the diagonal. And so yeah, the e4 square is available to this knight potentially, which could be used to attack d6. So queen takes h7, taking that knight instead of knight on c4 has been favoured. And okay, it's two rooks for the queen, and in theory you might think, well, doesn't black have a material advantage? Well, king safety has actually been compromised, and white is actually threatening now bishop h5 check as well, winning, well, doing some actual damage, not just taking the rook, but maybe doing some damage after king f8, getting a strong attack with knight e4. Note the use of the e4 square. As an example, say we're a human being in this position and doing a casual move. Let's see what devastation exists. Knight e4, using that e4 square, you know, that pawn sack gave the e4 square. There's a very famous game, Penrose Tower, with an e5 and Penrose crash through, making use of the e4 square. It's a good vacating move, but also the diagonal we see here is important. This kind of position looks very, very bad for black if d6 is going to drop. So black has to play very, very accurately here. Black keeps up with a forcing move in this position, rook h8, not giving white time to do anything, it seems. And now, not a casual move here, as you'd expect, but one which really is focused on damaging this structure here, this c5 d6 structure. And it's an impressive positional move with that intention, actually. If the d6 pawn can be undermined, that son of sorrow pawn, then e5 is a bit loosened. So I wonder if you can spot what white plays here. If I gave you 5 seconds to pause the video here. Okay, queen b1. The queen is preparing now b4 to be able to hit the pawn chain with b takes there. And that might give lots of possibilities like queen b6. So rook hf8 is played. Now not b4 in this position, although it does seem playable, but actually knight e4 looking at d6. King e7, and now we see b4. So look at this pawn chain under great scrutiny. Black plays c4, but it creates a weakness of the last move. Not just weakening d4, but in fact the entire diagonal. So a similar story that we had here. This whole diagonal is now weakened from g1 to a7. In fact, white's next move celebrates that scientifically with queen g1, and it actually means the entry point here, b6, is available for hitting d6. So this pawn chain has been compromised slightly. Can black actually defend the b6 square, or is there another problem on the cards? Let's say intuitively black played b5, just as an example. Actually in this position knight takes d6 exists, so takes queen c5 checkmate. So black actually chose bishop f5 here, not seemingly minding queen b6. Let's just try b6 as well as another example. It seems interesting here that actually my Stockfish, I'm not sure this is entirely the best move if it was given more depth, actually chooses queen d4, which seems to have the threat potentially, well, I'm not entirely sure actually what even the threat is. It does seem to create that pin. Is it leaving black in a position of almost paralysis here? What does black actually do? Well, it's an interesting position. It's given us a slightly better for white, but I'm not entirely sure what white is threatening. White might be positionally playing a5, I guess. Say we have rook f7, a5, and then that's again this problem with knight d6. So black has to be careful here. It's better for white, but anyway, in the game, actually bishop f5 inviting queen b6. Queen b6 is played, looking at d6. d6 is protected, giving up b7, it seems, but I'm pretty sure there's a catch here. It wasn't played. Queen takes b7 wasn't played. Let's see what the catch is. Knight d2. Well, the knight's hanging. So this actually there's just rook d7, and we've got the knight hanging, so we can't do that. Knight d2. Now we see c3. Check. Picking up the pawn. Actually, so was c3 actually needed here? Well, the c4 pawn looks vulnerable. This structure has been compromised, and they seem to be falling off like ripe apples, these pawns now. But I mean, who in a human game would have done this maneuver, queen b1, b4, and queen g1? You know, dislodging the c5 and d6 structure. It is quite fascinating how this c4. This c-pawn, this poor c-pawn, has been victimized here and is dropping off tactically. So check, queen takes c3. But, okay, black's lost its pawn majority on the queen side. But there's two rooks for the queen. So is it easy? Rook c8, queen e3. Pinning, and now it looks as though knight c4 will be a hard punch for e5. Check, rook f7. And here, okay, let's have a look at if knight c4 was played. Black has rook c3, a very tactical move, rook c3. So that is indirectly being prevented because queen takes, there's knight g4 check. So this isn't played here. Instead, white plays h5. Okay, and black steps out of the pin with king f8, but now this wonderful e4 square is used, this with knight e4, looking at d6, the son of sorrow pawn again. Rook f1, threatening a mate in 1. Bishop f4, giving the king g3. Still looking at d6, rook ce1. Now here, what is the punishment? Well, with the bishop pinned, actually, black is threatening knight g4 check. So that pawn can't be taken for a moment. King g3. And it looks as though both knight takes d6 now and bishop takes h6 are both threatened in this position. Knight c4 is played. Queen d3. And black starts to get a bit desperate here. I think he's starting to fall to bits here. The knight's attacked and the bishop's attacked, it seems. So we see rook takes f4, giving up the exchange. King takes. b5. Although all of black's pieces look quite impressive, the theoretical material advantage is increasing for white. After takes, we see actually king g3. Tempting, it would seem, would be bishop e5 check. I wonder if that actually does anything. Black played rook a1. If bishop e5 check, king f2, it seems okay for white, and actually this might help white because of g4 later. g5 trying to create a passed pawn. So actually that wasn't bothered with. Rook a1, knight d2, so trying to uproot this knight. Rook a3, knight b3, that was pinning to the queen, queen to the king. Bishop f6, king f2, and with king f2 actually there's an immediate idea of now queen g6, which would be quite horrible. Knight e5 protecting g6, attacking the queen. Queen c2, knight f7, king f1, bishop h8 now is played, and here we see bishop d1, which frees the queen because it's now protecting the knight, and the queen can now torture that d6 pawn potentially. I know it's protected at the moment, but also there might be some entry points as well after that. Bishop e5, queen c7 is played, making use of the bishop protecting the knight. So attacking the bishop, bishop e8, and now we see the bishop going from a defensive role to a more attacking one, bishop c2. So this is a useful diagonal. Knight g5, and now queen d8 pinning that bishop. Knight f7, queen c8 keeping the pin. Bishop g7, king e2, bishop e5. For the moment it looks as though, where is white going to crack black's position? The king now comes to d1, rook a4, taking the pressure off the knight. Why was that needed? Because now white takes the opportunity to play bishop g6. So before going on from here, let's have a look. Why couldn't the rook stay on a3? Can we give black a move? Say bishop g7. I think knight a5 might be strong here. Knight a5 and then bishop g6 anyway. So this is becoming possible. So okay, rook a4, bishop g6, giving up the b pawn. So rook takes b4. The knight can hardly use these squares, so it goes to that a5 square, and it looks to be coming now to c6, which would hit quite a few squares, key squares. Check, king e2, giving up d5 as well. Fascinating stuff. So giving up b4 and d5 there, for what exactly? Well, knight c6 now. So there's a kind of pin here, there's a pin here, and the knight's threatening some naughty stuff as well. Bishop f6 is played, and now queen e6. So the knight's holding that e5 square. The bishop can't play here because of taking here. And in fact, is black tied up in knots in this position and can't actually easily defend? Queen takes d5 and queen takes f6. black gives up the exchange here. Was this needed? Black has to play rook e5, it seems, here. This is a bad position. Let's just step back for a moment. Was that absolutely forced to get these loose pieces? After the check here, knight c6, we saw black playing bishop f6 in this position, allowing queen e6. White is actually, in any case, threatening queen e6. So, for sake of argument, let's assume, for example, b4, just to see this in action. Queen e6, rook c5, check. It's winning the bishop on e8. I think that's the key thing, and protecting the knight on c6. So it seems black's pieces were getting slightly on the loose side in any case here. So bishop f6, queen e6, it does seem to be picking up another exchange. So knight takes e5, bishop takes. And now after bishop takes f7, bishop takes, the position seems untenable for black and it was resigned on behalf of the computer. Continuation could be, for example, taking here, creating that passed pawn. Queen g5 check, and maybe taking this one, and it's eventually going to be lost for black. White's going to just march its pawns in theory, or something like that, slowly. Okay, I thought it was quite a fascinating game from the dark square grip perspective, and how the thematic move we're used to thematically as humans, e5, seems to be used in a way I've not ever seen in a human game before, actually. How resourcefully this idea of e5 being used here. And the two rooks for the queen was also interesting, but the idea of e5 to eventually hit this pawn chain I thought was quite fascinating, with this moving back here for b4 for queen g1. I think these are quite majestic movements, quite pretty movements, just from a kind of pattern perspective, getting to that b6 square potentially. So very, very dynamic game, obviously, and fascinating to see computers being forced to play the modern Benoni, which had its heyday in the times of Mikhail Tal, who massively increased its popularity. I think after Tal's 1960 match, he started to become a bit more positional after his 1961, after losing the match, the return match to Mikhail Botvinnik. He started, I think, not playing it as much, the Benoni, I suspect. But there was a time when this was a very, very popular opening for black. But yeah, the way White's played this is quite remarkable, really. I mean, there's a remarkable pattern to it. So here, I mean, these pieces from this position, actually, if you look at this, get really aggressive. The knight heading for c6, the bishop to g6, the queen to e6 eventually. It's a lot of pressure points here that are being exerted on black once these pieces reach c6, e6 and g6 here. c6, e6 and g6. So the knight and queen are supporting queen e7 of the bishop moves. It's forcing the loss of an exchange here. And if black didn't take on d5, I mean, it's still going to happen. Knight c6 is still going to happen. So this was quite a vicious maneuver, this just giving up the b pawn here, getting knight to c6. Yeah, it forcing that other loss of the exchange. So a remarkable set of tactical exchanges there. Comments or questions on YouTube? Okay, thanks very much.